Sounds True presents Cosmic Consciousness with Ken Wilber. My name is Tammy Simon, and I'm the publisher of Sounds True. For almost a decade, I've known and been friends with Ken Wilber, and over the years, I've asked him repeatedly if he would be willing to record a teaching program with Sounds True. Year after year, he declined. Finally, in the spring of 2003, he agreed to spend 4 days recording with me in his Denver loft. My goal was simple and direct, to hear Ken Wilber describe the integral model in his own spoken words, and to bring forward the aspects of his teaching work that could provide the most benefit to human evolution. So here we go, recorded live, the Ken Wilber Sessions on Cosmic Consciousness. Ken, I know you've been reluctant to do audio programs in the past, and I'm wondering what's happened now that you're willing in the last couple years and now here with Sounds True to present your work in an oral format?
Well, one is our friendship. And I've told you for quite some time that if I started doing this, that I'd, just soon do it with you as anybody.
Thank you.
What tends to happen is once you do something like this, then some of your other friends who have similar types of setups want you to sort of do something with them as well. So I sort of wanted to keep my virginity as long as possible, just so I wouldn't have to figure out who to date. Now is the appropriate time to do it. So I figure we'll start talking, see what happens.
Okay, let's date. Do you think there's a difference in the way people will apprehend your work in listening to it than in reading it?
Almost certainly. And part of the difficulty, I think, is particularly in person, so much of what I tend to convey tends to be body language or tone or something like that. It'd probably be even better if people could, see a film or a video. Because in the written form, a whole lot of what I do doesn't come across very well, strangely enough, because what I've done is write so much. But particularly, I have a really warped sense of humor. I'm usually making jokes. I'm usually smiling when I'm talking about something. And if you simply transcribe that and read it, it can sound cold, it can sound mean, and so on. So a lot of people sometimes get upset if I'm being critical from the written word, and they almost hate me for that. Whereas if they see me in person, then they hate me for all the right reasons. They actually come to see the full me, and they're disgusted with that instead of just the written form. But yeah, I think people get an entirely different sense when they hear me and see me than they do on the written page.
Okay, so just in starting, Ken, for people who aren't that familiar with your work, are we meeting now a philosopher, a map maker, a theorist? What's the best word to use for the lens that you use for your work?
I've sort of really trained in none of those. It's more strange as it sounds. It's kind of a storytelling, and it's sort of one of the things that human beings do is, on the one hand, they live their lives, and on the other hand, they make maps about it, they tell stories about it, they represent it, they make theories about it. It can be complicated, less complicated, and so on. And obviously, people wonder about it. They philosophize. Sometimes it's more intense and serious. And other times it's just sort of casual. But everybody sort of carries around their own philosophy of life, because you sort of, to be human is to kind of reflect on those things that are arising around you. And when you start to hook those together in a way that makes sense, then you're not just sort of coming up with random ideas, you're sort of telling stories. You're telling coherent stories. And really good philosophers are really, really good storytellers. And really good psychologists are really good storytellers. Sigmund Freud got one award in his life, and it was the Goethe Award for Literature, of all things. And you read Freud's early case histories, and they're like Sherlock Holmes. I mean, they're these extraordinary literary masterpieces. Now, a lot of his psychological theories haven't held up, but his storytelling was exquisite. And I think that's sort of, in a sense, what it is. So I'm telling a very, very complicated story in a certain sense, because it's trying to hook together a whole lot of various theories, ideas, facts, data, and so on. But it's still nothing but kind of a story that we can tell ourselves if we reflect on all this.
Well, it's interesting that you start there, because as I began reading your work for this conversation, I thought this is either incredibly accurate or the best fiction or both. Ken's a fiction writer, in a sense. I mean, as I was reading it.
I don't have any trouble with that.
Well, that you're sort of a self-proclaimed storyteller, in a sense.
In a sense, yeah. Yeah, and obviously part of the things you want to do is, when you get into it, there's sort of different types of stories. And obviously we do make a distinction between fiction stories and nonfiction stories. And the general distinction is that a nonfiction story is supposed to correspond to something real, vaguely, somewhere. Whereas fiction is supposedly you can make it up and it's not true, everything. But reality itself, I mean, Lily Tomlin said, what's reality? Nothing but a collective hunch. And that's sort of true in a certain sense. So even the line between fiction and nonfiction can be pretty blurry every now and then. But the general idea, sure, is I try to tell a little bit more stories in a sense that have some nonfiction components to them. So they're kind of docudramas. In other words, there's a claim that we're representing some form of truth or reality that you can depend on. And so the stories I tell are more like this. Let's say we're looking at psychology or spirituality or sociology or any of the sort of various areas that we're talking about. And I will say something like, I'm going to tell you a story about psychological growth, and then you go check it out yourself and see if the story I'm telling you is true, what makes sense to you. So a large part of what I do is I take facts, data, evidence from all sorts of different sources, and I try to tell stories that are in some sense true. They represent something dependable. But it's always open to evidence and facts, and it can always be checked out. And probably, I mean, I sort of see it as kind of an ongoing docudrama on sort of the big picture of what does it all mean, how does it all fit together, what's the meaning of life, the universe, God, everything, all that kind of stuff. But those are big stories, and they ought not to be told as dry metaphysics. They ought to be told as really galloping good stories. I mean, if you really get into it, there's just nothing more interesting. And that's sort of what I try to do. And you try to tell it with a certain kind of, fizz and pizzazz. I mean, philosophy is supposed to be really passionate. And I've never quite understood the academic philosophers that, get in races to see who can put more students to sleep quicker. I just don't think that's what it's about. I mean, I appreciate them doing it. I see why they do it. But I think it's a very limited kind of story that they're doing. So I think one of the reasons that some people are intimidated by some of the work I do, because it seems to be this terribly academic stuff. But a common experience that I hear anyway when people get into even a very difficult book like Sex, Ecology, Spirituality, sort of 900-page monster, is that it's really fun. They really get into it and they really have a good time. Because these people are deranged or institutionalized or the vitamin B deficiency or something like that. Many of them have a really good time. And that's mostly what I hope happens.
So as a storyteller of the big picture, what gets included in your picture and what gets left out? How do you make that decision? I mean, you're known as the map maker who has included everything, but obviously not everything. Some theories and some people's work you toss out. How do you make that decision?
Well, I actually try not to toss out anybody, but part of what you want to do with a map, and that's the first thing that's important to say, is really what I am doing is presenting a map. Everybody knows the map is not the territory. Nobody knows this better than I do. I do not confuse the map with the territory. I don't take the map that seriously. On the other hand, if you're trying to get across a certain territory, it helps to have a reliable map. And so that's one of the things you want to try to do, is you don't want to confuse them. But on the other hand, you don't want to have a crappy map. And a lot of people sort of going around in a sense with a philosophy of life that amounts to a pretty crappy map compared to what you could have if you sort of included more evidence and more information and so on in that map. So whenever you're doing any form of map making, obviously you're faced with just that decision, which is, okay, if I want a map of downtown Manhattan, what do I put on it? How much? I mean, the main buildings, okay, the main streets, okay. But as you start getting down into details, all sorts of stuff gets left out. And really, really good map makers know the level of abstraction to operate at. In other words, if you're trying to give a kind of a comprehensive map, it can't be so detailed that people look at it, and it just makes no sense at all. I mean, you've included so much stuff in it that it's not really helpful to use the map instead of reality, because the reality is probably not much more complex than the map, and you might as well just deal with the real territory. So you want to have some sort of map that's simple enough, but it can't be so simple it's just get you in trouble. If you look at the map, it just leaves out all sorts of important things, and then you really don't know your way around very well at all. And that's part of what I think is just the learning process of being a good map maker. And in the case, what I'm trying to do, in a sense, is make a map of human potential, human possibilities, all of the things that men and women can become, and all the things they have available to them in terms of their own growth, development, realization, capacities, activities, and so on. And so what I've done in really sort of a 30-year career is look at all the different maps from different cultures, look at all the different practices from different cultures, the various philosophies from different cultures, and kind of put all of them together, East and West, North and South, pre-modern, modern, postmodern, and said, okay, here's all of this sort of enormous number of potentials that human beings have reported over the last 10,000 years. Now, can we see any patterns here? If we put all this stuff on the table, is some sort of overall map start to suggest itself? And I believe that one does, and that's that generalized map, and we call it integral for sort of comprehensive. And that kind of integral map or integral approach is what I've tried to represent in these various books and so on. And there are lots of other people involved in these kinds of projects. I'm not the only one doing it. But the sort of integral map that I've come up with is one that a lot of people are comfortable with in terms of it probably includes the most number of things from the most number of different sources. And so if you want to do something like look at an integral map, this is probably a good place to begin. But it's an ongoing process.
Just to understand your map-making process,
yeah.
Here you've got all of these different maps from history on the table from different disciplines.
Yeah.
How did you decide, well, I'm going to pay attention to these, and I'm going to put these over in the left pile and these over in the right pile, and these I'm going to put under the table or in the trash can? Or how did that sorting process work for you?
There's sort of a general rule that I sort of summarize the integral approach with, and it's the phrase, everybody is right. Now, on the surface, it's kind of a platitude in a certain sense. I mean, it doesn't say very much, but I take it really seriously. And I for whatever reason, from when I was in my really late teens and early 20s when I started this, as you know, I sort of wrote my first book when I was 23, so I was deranged quite early. I mean, I was already a deeply confused young man who would want to sit around and actually do this kind of stuff. If I've had any guiding intuition over the years, it's just that. I don't believe any human mind is capable of producing 100% error. And that means that every single position that's ever been offered has some important piece of this puzzle. And so under those circumstances, you really want to go back and look at all of the major sciences, philosophies, religions, and so on, and say, okay, what important piece of truth are they offering? Now, obviously, that's it. Certainly when it starts, that can be a very subjective thing. Well, I like this, I don't like that. And all of a sudden, you don't really have a map of reality. You have a map of Ken Wilber's preferences. And that's exactly what you don't want. I mean, that's a nightmare. So what you do is you look for recurrent patterns. If you're looking at the world's religions, for example, and you find 5 or 6 or 7 things that most of the world's traditional religions agree on, then that's very interesting. All of a sudden, that's probably something that you really want to pay attention to. But at the same time, as you're developing this sort of overview or comprehensive map or model, you want to make sure that all of these different positions have room on that map. Now, it doesn't mean that they're going to have the whole truth, but it does mean that there has to be an important place at the table for all of them in that sense. And then ultimately what happens, even when you sort of done, compiling all this stuff, and it can get very complex and very confusing and all of that, it also shakes down in some very, very simple applications. Things like first, second, and third person pronouns, I, we, and it, turn out to be the good, the true, and the beautiful. That's art, morals, and science, those kinds of things. So all of a sudden you're starting to find a kind of coherence in the midst of this sort of chaotic jumble. And that's what good map making can do. But again, it's definitely a tricky process in terms of what you leave in, what you leave out. And you sort of get better at that as you go along.